All right, y'all. So we're going to get started with notes here for Unit 4, Topic 4.4, which is Maritime Empires Established. So make sure that you have your guided notes and make sure that you have those before beginning this lecture. It's going to be a lot of information, so make sure that you have everything ready to go. Now, the first section of this lecture really covers the theme of governance and government. So politics, if we were to be using the SPICE-T theme acronym. Okay, so our learning objective in this section, explaining the process of state building and expansion among various empires and states in the period from 1450 to 1750. So again, we'll talk about some of the things we've already touched on: trading posts in Africa and Asia, which provide profit for the rulers and merchants involved in new global trade networks. We'll talk about Asian states. We'll talk about political, religious, economic rivalries between European states and maritime empires, including the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and so on. So those are all of the things that we will talk about here in this section. So before we get into a lot of new detail, we want to remember back to topic 4.2. And we want to remember that Vasco da Gama sailed to India on behalf of Portugal, right? We want to remember he took this wider angle around the coast of Africa, swung his ships around the Cape of Good Hope, and then made it all the way to Calicut in India. This was a voyage that really opened up a new route to India and Southeast Asia from Europe for the Portuguese. Now, because the Portuguese had been the ones to really engage heavily in maritime trade with West Africa, and because, again, they are the first to make the trip around Africa to Asia, most of the African coast, both on the west side and eastern side, is heavily affected and heavily influenced by the Portuguese. During that first trip to India, for example, Vasco da Gama takes note of these busy, bustling ports, cities in Africa, on particularly the east coast, and the unarmed merchant ships that really carry valuable cargo. So we want to remember that this trip in 1498 from Vasco da Gama that really is going to set in motion a series of events that are going to help establish the maritime empire for the Portuguese. So let's dive into that a little bit further. So, speaking on the eastern coast of Africa, this brings us to the Swahili city states. Swahili roughly translates to people of the coast. And the Swahili coast really becomes an area of interest for the Portuguese after Vasco da Gama's trip to India. It's in this region that da Gama witnesses and engages with and encounters these very active ports that are involved in very lucrative, very important trade along the Indian Ocean, which we've talked about previously before when we talked about Indian Ocean trade. Now, the Swahili city states are 35 independent cities that really thrive on trade. And again, we want to remember all of these keywords that we've talked about. City states, for example, that's a city that operates as its own independent state or country. Now, from the 12th century to the 15th century, these trading cities grow and prosper from this trade. So, very wealthy, very prosperous. And the people who live here, the inhabitants of the Swahili coast, they are largely Muslim, which makes the merchants that are associated with these cities Muslim merchants. So, on the map here that you see of the east coast of Africa, we have four of the kind of largest or most major Swahili trading cities states labeled. These are all of interest to the Portuguese after Vasco da Gama's first voyage. So you have Mogadishu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and Kilwa. Some of these we've already talked about, but these are the four main major cities that become of interest to the Portuguese. And again, in topic 4.2, we really sort of briefly discussed Portugal's trading post empire. And we want to remember what that meant. A trading post empire is not an empire where Portugal took large swaths of territory. They set up small trading posts, small forts, small little cities, small towns, really to have influence. And this, again, consists of small ports along Africa coasts, in Southeast Asia, for example, that really help Portugal maintain control of these trade routes. So, to begin a more in depth look at some of these trading posts and how they are established, we'll start here with Mombasa, which is located in present day Kenya here in East Africa. So, Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope is really more than like a simple exploration or a simple expedition to locate a new route, right? There's many encounters with African cities along the way, and a lot of those encounters really pave the way for what the Portuguese will do later on and how the Portuguese will dominate this region, and establishing trading ports and establishing colonies and so on. And really, as we start to look at the European powers really colonizing various territories. So when Vasco da Gama's crew approaches the waters near the port of Mombasa, right, they encounter unarmed Arab merchant ships. Now, these Portuguese vessels, they do have artillery, they do have weaponry, and Vasco da Gama and his crew begin to attack and rob, or what we would also refer to as looting, these merchant ships in the area. So when Vasco da Gama comes into Mombasa, he and his crew become the very first Europeans to visit the city. But the Portuguese are not received well. They're not welcome because, again, there's experience of them attacking these ships and they leave pretty soon after. So, but Mombasa's location makes it a really big point of interest for the Portuguese who want to gain access and gain control of Indian Ocean trade. It's then 2 years after Vasco da Gama's initial visit to Mombasa that the Portuguese come back to the city in 1500 and launch an attack. They cause a lot of destruction. They damage the city. They sack the city. And after that, you have various Portuguese navigators who come and pay visits to Mombasa. Tristan da Cunha comes in 1506, and his son Nuno comes and destroys the city of Mombasa in 1528 when the city refuses to pay tribute to Portugal. And that's an important term again, tribute, right? We've talked about tributary states, not only in South China, but in um, the Aztec societies, right? So tributary states are still a thing here. Now, Mombasa is captured from the Portuguese in 1585 by the Ottomans and by the Somalis. And in 1589, the Portuguese take over Mombasa again. They reconquer Mombasa and they built Fort Jesus, which is pictured here on the right, Fort Jesus, pretty much, to defend their claim to the territory. Now, the fort would be taken a total of 9 times by different countries attempting to gain some sort of control over Mombasa and the trade routes. But it's really not important that you memorize the individual Portuguese navigators that visit Mombasa. It's not really important that you remember the years that these attacks happen or who took over the city when. What is important for you to understand is the reason why Mombasa is such a highly desired place and a highly desired spot on the eastern coast of Africa, right? Portugal invests a lot in taking Mombasa, invests a lot in maintaining its control over it because it is an extremely valuable trading post. It is super important. It lies along these trading routes to Southeast Asia that Portugal is trying to establish itself in, right? So not so much important to remember the dates, the individual dates, and we will reiterate this point in AP World History for a long time. The dates themselves are not important. Placing them in rough time periods is important as well, but the important thing is to understand the why, the content of what Mombasa reflects and what that means for Portugal. Now, Vasco da Gama sails past the city state of Kiowa in 1498. And when he returns to Portugal, right, he's talking about his interaction with Mombasa. His, main primary objective sailing around the Cape of Good Hope is to try to establish this trade treaty with Calicut in India. He's not successful, but in 1499, he reports all of these findings to the Portuguese king, King Manuel, um, and he gives Portugal a lot of information about the Indian Ocean trade that really leads to these frequent and recurring expeditions around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. In 1500, you have a second Portuguese armada that's commanded by Pedro Cabral, who visits Kilwa, another city state along the eastern coast of Africa. And he attempts to reach this commercial trade alliance treaty, but is unsuccessful. So then in 1502, you have the fourth Portuguese armada, which is led in this instance again by Vasco da Gama, that comes back to Kilwa in a very aggressive manner and forces them to pay a large tribute payment to Portugal from the city's leader. And again, this is where that understanding of what a tributary state is: pay up, or we're going to either take over you, kill you, damage your city, whatever the case may be. And that does happen. In 1505, you have Francisco de Almeida bringing his fleet, his Portuguese fleet, into the harbor of Kilwa. And this is when, in 1505, that Portugal takes over the city, builds a fort, Fort Santiago, so that the Portuguese can maintain control over the city and its trade. Now, again, is it super important that you remember all of these dates in specific? No. But why? Why do we want control over Cuba? Because it also sits on this eastern coast of Africa. It is also important along these Indian Ocean trade routes. So it's really about establishing Portuguese control in this region. And while the Portuguese are able to kind of make these mutual trade agreements in some places on the East African coast, the Portuguese are not welcomed everywhere, right? They're not welcomed with open arms. They're not seen as liberators or anything like that. So, like we see in Mombasa, there's resistance to the Portuguese takeover of Kilwa as well. Portugal imposes these mercantilist laws on the Kilwan Sultanate, which really say that only Portuguese ships could conduct business with other nearby cities, right? So this puts restrictions on the merchants that do business out of Kilwa. Kilwa is built on this ocean trade over several centuries prior to the Portuguese arriving. And so this really harms them. And we'll see a lot of these examples of mercantilism. We talked about what mercantilism is, right? And we will talk about it again multiple times. Francisco de Almeida installs a puppet president, like a puppet leader, Mohammed Arcon, who is a vassal to the Portuguese king. And this is where, again, that term we learned in 1.6 becomes important. A vassal is someone who is loyal to the king, right? A noble person who is loyal to the king. So here we have a puppet leader who pledges his loyalty to the Portuguese king in exchange for being in control. Now, when Almeida leaves, Mohammed Arcon is killed. And this leads to a series of internal conflicts in Kilwa that leads to a lot of destruction in the city. And this is in right around 1506, just over a year after the Portuguese establish Arcon as this vassal leader, about a year after they built the fort. Um, and by the time we get to 1512, the Portuguese had completely abandoned Fort Santiago. It was taken over by the Omanis, the Omani Arabs. And pictured on the slide here is what's left of Fort Santiago. This is after the Omani Arabs kind of added on to the fort. So it's not all original Portuguese construction. So there's different things that have been added on here. But the Portuguese completely leave Quilwa in 1512. Now, what are these India armadas, these Portuguese India armadas, right? How does Portugal establish this maritime empire? So, again, Vasco da Gama creates this route in 1498. He sails around the coast of Africa, around the southern tip of Africa, and returns back to Portugal in 1499. Every year that after that, right after Vasco da Gama's first voyage, Portugal puts in place a schedule of missions that would retrace his route. And they leave Lisbon once a year through 1511. So from 1499 to 1511, these are India armadas, right? Each armada, each group of ships, right? That's what an armada is, has a specific goal that's related to expanding Portuguese maritime influence and maritime empire in Africa and Asia. So the missions to Kilwa, for example, the missions to Mombasa that we've talked about were part of different missions for these India armadas. The largest of these armadas uh, that was sent to India had 20 ships, like roughly 1,500 to 1,800, almost 2,000 sailors. And in addition to those armadas, excuse me, my apologies, Portugal sends expeditions to Brazil, to the New World during their empire building process. So, the Portuguese are just sending ships over and over and over again. And we can see what ships these are. These are the Portuguese caraques, right? And we can tell that again by the shape of the sails. The sails are square, but there's also some triangular shaped ones as there as well. So it's a mix of the two shapes. But this is from 1507, the 1507 India Armada. And so, again, they have lots of different missions: getting trade agreements, building forts, building port cities, building warehouses, storage, getting rid of competition, whether that's through being pirates, right? I know some of you wanted to talk about pirates, stealing things, destroying cities, whatever it took. Get rid of the competition, build some storage, and build up the forts and influence. So keep that in mind about how did Portugal build up this empire? Because Portugal is really different. It's very different to how other European powers really set about expanding their global empires. Rather than kind of trying to conquer and control huge territories, the Portuguese really focused on building forts, building warehouses at very strategic locations. These strategic locations were meant to give them control and influence over trade routes. They didn't want to control large territory, but they were very aggressive. They used very forceful military tactics to force these well-positioned cities, these well-located cities, to allow some form of Portuguese presence. This is often, achieved through very violent means. So using fear to maintain control of the empire was one of the main sources. But Portugal set up trading posts really in an effort to just dominate the spice trade with Southeast Asia. So you have some of the trading posts labeled here on the map. So, for example, we've already talked about Sierra Leone before. We've mentioned Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Kilwa here in Africa. And again, the Strait of Hormuz, which you see there on the Arabian Peninsula, that is still today a very important strait. And we talked about the Strait of Malacca before in Unit 1 when we talked about Southeast Asia. But you have all of those trading posts on the western coasts of India, in Diu and Chal, in Goa, in Calicut, in Cochin. These are some very, very important ones. These all represent some form of fort, some form of commercial warehouse, some port city that's built by the Portuguese and controlled, or in some cases attempted to control, the territory around them. And again, the west coast of India is a major area for Portuguese presence. Brazil, however, here's the difference. Brazil in South America is what we think of as the more traditional colonization story, and where they do try to occupy a large scale territory. And we'll talk about that later. But here, as far as in Afro Eurasia, particularly in Asia and Africa, the way that Portugal tries to set up its empire is through the use of forts, warehouses, and what we would call a trading post empire. Now, thus far, we've really spoken quite extensively about Portugal's empire building efforts, particularly in East Africa and India with its trading post empire. But it's also important to know that West Africa is also really heavily influenced by the Portuguese. The papal bull, which it's called a papal bull, which is essentially like a ruling or an edict from the Pope, that Romanus Pontifex was issued um, in January of 1455 by Pope Nicholas V to Catholic King Alfonso V of Portugal. So it's important to remember that in this period, The Pope is the one who usually settled any kind of disputes, would draw lines for Catholic states, decide borders and things like that. It was really up to the Pope. And it's in this sort of what we would call a decree, but at the time, and probably still is, called a papal bull. This papal bull gives Portugal control over all lands south of Cape Bojador in Africa. So you can see the location on the map of Cape Bojador, and it protects Portugal's trade and colonization of the area. So again, this is in 1455. So when we think of why, a couple of reasons why Christopher Columbus decides that sailing west is probably the easiest thing to do and probably the best idea, rather than trying to sail through the Mediterranean or even try to sail around Africa, right? It's because there's no room really for Spain to take over any territory or establish itself along the western coast of Africa or in Africa in general, right? They were given all of this land south of Cape Bojador and protecting their trade and colonization in the area. So after this, you see growth and increases in slavery in Portugal after they start to explore sub-Saharan Africa. One factor that leads to this growing demand for slaves in the 15th century is a labor shortage. There just aren't enough people to do the work in Portugal. Portugal traded with the Kingdom of Benin in the 15th century, beginning in 1485. And goods that are traded to Portugal include brass, ivory, and slaves. And in return, Portugal gives Benin gunpowder, gives them alcohol, and other things. So, this Portuguese trade in Benin really increases the wealth of the kingdom and their dominance over the area. The slaves for gunpowder trade is very important because slaves are going to really drive the Portuguese Empire forward. Gunpowder and weapons is going to really change the power dynamics in several African kingdoms that really engage in trade with Portugal. You have on the slide here, you have an ivory statue from Benin that really exemplifies and exhibits some of that Portuguese influence. But it is this papal decree from Pope Nicholas in 1455 that really sets the stage for Portugal to really be able to take advantage here in Western Africa. And that takes us to the Kingdom of the Congo. When Portugal begins trading with the Congo, and you'll notice it's spelled differently than it is spelled today. They begin trading with the Congo in the 1500s. This is just to show you the influence of Portugal in the region. The name of the king of the Congo is King Alfonso, who is pictured here on the slide. Alfonso is a Portuguese name given to the king after he becomes the first vassal king to Portugal in the Congo. And again, remember the term vassal, someone who is put in place or established in power, a noble person who gives their loyalty to the king. And in this case, it's to the king of Portugal. He's born Nzinga Mbemba. He's baptized Christian in 1491 by a Portuguese priest. He's given the name Alfonso. And in 1512, King Alfonso reaches an agreement with Portugal that officially establishes a steady trade of slaves, solidifies this relationship between Portugal and the Congo, Portuguese Congo relations. And it is this relationship with the Portuguese that King Alfonso rebuilds Mbanza Congo, which is the capital city. He builds it out of stone. He expands the kingdom's borders. He builds the Congo's first Roman Catholic Church. He is sometimes referred to as the Apostle of the Congo because he really facilitates and helps the Portuguese desire to make the Congo a Christian kingdom. And the Congo is heavily influenced by its trade relationship with Congo. And we'll talk about the slave trade with the Congo again when we get into labor systems later on in Unit 4. And while we're on the subject of the Portuguese, we don't want to forget Asia as a whole and Japan here. The first European traders to make it all the way to Japan are the Portuguese in 1453. This event marks the beginning of what is called the Nanban trading period. Nanban means, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, and one of your classmates is probably going to correct me, but whatever. But Nanban means Southern Barbarian, and it's used to refer to the Chinese, Southeast Asian, and eventually the Portuguese and Dutch traders that come to Japan. Japan was trading with China and Southeast Asia, and then largely, opens up widely with Portugal its trade. Portugal's posts in India and Macau, which is in the Philippines, allowed the Portuguese initially to really dominate trade with Japan compared to other European powers. Now, the Europeans would bring textiles, fabrics, gold to Japan, and Japan exported lacquerware, silver. And just really a few years after the arrival of the Portuguese to Japan, you start to see the introduction of Christianity. And there's conversions to Christianity that happen in Japan that later will cause tensions that help move Japan towards enacting more isolationist policies and trying to close itself off to this outside influence. And we will definitely talk about that in some more detail. And when we spoke about Japan, I don't even know when that was. Was that Unit 1? We did touch on the Tokugawa period in Japan, which was also known as the Edo period, which refers to this military government of Japan from 1603 to 1868. And it's the beginning of this Tokugawa period that Japan participates actively in foreign trade. Now, Japan had been trading with other Asian states, right? And again, the first European traders to Japan are the Portuguese, which were later followed by the Dutch, the English, the Spanish. And again, this is when we start to see the introduction of Christianity introduced into Japan. It's introduced to Japan like prior to the Tokugawa period in 1603, but it really starts to grow in influence around 1610. And it is the growth of Christianity in Japan at this time that is viewed as a threat to the shogunate. So you start to see laws that are introduced that ban Christianity in Japan in the 1630s. This banning of Christianity comes hand in hand with tightening restrictions on trade. We start to see foreign trade starting to be, which had been really unrestricted during this Nanban period that comes before the Tokugawa. But there are problems with piracy in the waters. And between 1633 and 1633 and 1639, the shogunate enacts laws that restrict trade in Japan. So Japan moves towards isolationism, but it is not completely isolated from trade. Trade continues with China, with Korea, and the Dutch through very specific trading points. The Dutch continue trading with Japan through the Dutch East India Company, and the Japanese allow this trade to continue because the Dutch agreed not to engage in any missionary activities in Japan, right? Not spreading Christianity. And remember, when we talked about seeing images of Portuguese and Spanish ships versus seeing images of Dutch ships, the Portuguese and the Spanish ships all have crosses, right, on their sails, and the Dutch don't. That's one way to really tell the difference between a Spanish and a Portuguese ship and a Dutch ship. The Dutch never really put crosses, very rarely, if ever, put crosses on their sails. Their interest was trade, their interest was commerce, their interest was doing business, not spreading Christianity, not doing any missionary activity. So that's why the Dutch are still allowed to trade, but Japan closes themselves off to the Spanish, to the Portuguese, etc., but really only interacts further with China and Korea and the Dutch under really specific conditions. So again, looking at this timeline, 1548 is when Christianity is really first introduced into Japan. The 1610s, you start to see this Tokugawa period start in Japan, which sees the spread of Christianity as a threat. And it is in 1639 that Japan issues an edict, right? A decree, a law, however you want to define that. that specifically prohibits the Portuguese from engaging in any trade with Japan. The edict is issued only after Japan got assurance from the Dutch that the Dutch could make up for the lost trade with Portugal, right? So they're not going to close themselves off if they're going to lose out on something, right? They don't want to lose out on the trade, but they don't want the spread of Christianity to continue. The Dutch agree to trade through a specific port, the port of Nagasaki. They specifically agreed to refrain and not participate in any missionary activity. They really are only interested in doing business. And the Portuguese respond the year after, in 1640, in an effort to open trade relations back with Japan. A Portuguese ship from Macau gets to Japan in 1640 to try to negotiate the reopening of trade. The ship is captured, it's burned, and 61 members of the mission from Portugal are executed, right? So, again, think about how different the response is between Japan and the Congo, right? Japan sees Christianity as a threat, does not want it to really interact with their society. So they try to close Portugal off. The Congo welcomes this Christianity, uses it to their advantage, uses this trade relationship with Portugal to their advantage to rebuild their empire. Right. So just keep that in mind. Keep the differences. So when you get into a situation where on, say, the exam or on a quiz, whatever, or even on the AP exam, if you're asked really for in this instance like a comparison and contrast, that's an easy one to make. And it's important to know that the Japanese are not the only ones that implement some form of restrictions on trade in this period. You have the Ming Dynasty that's in charge and in power in China from 1368 to 1644. It's between 1405 and 1433 that you have Chinese explorer Zheng He, which thank you to your classmate who helped me learn how to pronounce that. Zheng He sailed a total of 7 voyages from China to various locations that bordered along the Indian Ocean, right? Expands Chinese maritime influence, but his expeditions don't have the goal of establishing any trade ports, discovering new lands, taking over territory, anything like that, but rather these fleets of ships, right, which are in some cases like enormous, sometimes 250 ships, are sent out really to show China's greatness. When the Yongle Emperor, who sponsors Zheng He's voyages, dies in 1424, the new emperor is more conservative, right? A more conservative Confucian. And he does not endorse this idea of going out and trading with others. So China is also facing threats along its land borders that needs focus and needs attention rather than sea trade. So something called a sea ban, and again, I know your classmate will probably correct me, but I believe it's pronounced Haijin, is issued during the Ming Dynasty, and she'll correct me if I'm wrong anyway. But it's issued during the Ming Dynasty, and it's meant to restrict trade and control piracy, control pirates. Private trade is no longer allowed in the seas of Ming China. And this is just one of several restrictive policies that are issued throughout the Ming Dynasty and the early Qing Dynasty. But trade does continue in some fashion despite efforts to restrict it. And in fact, the piracy problem only becomes worse after these sea bans are issued. Right? The sea bans in China are really similar to the edicts that the Japanese issued called Sokoku that we just talked about, but they're not as successful. But it really just sort of creates like this black market for trade. Now, up until at this point, we've focused really heavily on Portugal because they are the leaders of this European exploration movement and this movement to expand empires at the beginning of the time period. But remember, we've already talked about other European states that play major roles in this era as well. In the Americas, you have Spain that's really dominating colonization efforts. But Portugal, of course, had also staked its claim in Brazil. After Columbus's initial trip in 1492 to the Americas, Spain is really eager to keep its rival from claiming lands anywhere in the New World. So you have King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain calling upon the Pope, Pope Alexander the Sixth, who is born in Spain at the time. Well, not at the time. He was born in Spain and Pope at the time. Um, to help them keep Portugal out of the Americas. So the first line of demarcation, which was issued by the Pope in 1494, is marked by the green dotted line on the map. Okay. This is the original Treaty of Tordesillas line that gives Spain the right to any lands to the west of it. Portugal's to stay to the east of the line. Now, Portugal really complains that this line is too far east and it really impacted their ability to sail around Africa because ships sometimes had to go way out of the way because of winds and currents, for example. Pedro Cabral of Portugal, right, accidentally landed in Brazil in 1500 while trying to follow Vasco da Gama's route from his first voyage to Africa. How? I don't know. He got lost, right? Uh, but he went too far east, landed in Brazil, went too far west, excuse me, and landed in Brazil. So the line of demarcation was extended westward in 1506, which allows Portugal to claim and colonize Brazil. This line of demarcation, right, is again referred to as the Treaty of Tordesillas. The effects of that treaty are still evident, right? And we talked about this before in Unit 4. Most of South America, Latin America, Central America, Mexico, etc., speak Spanish. Brazil, modern day Brazil, predominantly uses Portuguese. And again, Spanish is the most widely used language in South American countries outside of Brazil. Why? Because of this line of demarcation, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. This slide here is really just an extremely brief look at two major Spanish conquests in the Americas. The orange areas of the map show the territory that's held by the Spanish in and around the year 1600. You have Hernan Cortes, which leads an expedition to destroy the Aztec Empire. He's gained control of the empire's territory by the time we get to 1521. Takes over the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which becomes Mexico City. Um, the former Aztec Empire had become the Spanish colony of New Spain within 3 years of Cortes's arrival. In South America, you have Francisco Pizarro, who wants to overthrow the Incas in Peru. Now, Pizarro was assassinated in Peru in 1541, but the Spanish continued to put effort into conquering the Incas well after his death. And by the time we get to 1572, the Spanish controlled all of the Incan Empire. Okay. Yesterday, we learned more about that when we watched the video, The Spanish Conquest of the Inca Empire. So hopefully that helped you explore that topic further. We also want to talk about the other European colonies that exist in the Americas as well. This map on this slide shows the British and the French colony boundaries right around the year 1650. You do see that the Dutch still have this small territory near what is New York, but really the major colonial rivalry in North America is between the English and the French. The British formed alliances with the native Indians, and I should say the Native Americans, excuse me, the native Iroquois, who had been fighting with the French over trade. And then over time, really, the Iroquois start to side with the French, who seem to be less of a threat than the British. But this rivalry will kind of culminate in a war, the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, which then would later, when we start getting into revolutions, becomes kind of a big factor for the American Revolution, right? The British um, the British win the French and Indian War, right? The French and the Iroquois, they fight against the British. The British win, but France would then give its territory east of the Mississippi River to the British. But the British will have to pay back the debt that they incur from this war. And so they charge that basically to the American colonists. The colonists don't like it. And there's the revolution. So we'll talk more about that when we get into revolutions. But this really just to give you a little bit of an idea of where those colonies exist here in North America. Now, slavery also becomes an issue and um, a source for rivalry between these European powers. In 1689, you have the Spanish colony of Florida beginning to offer asylum or safe haven to escaped slaves from the British Virginia colony. And the goal behind really this new policy is not really, like out of the goodness of their heart to give a safe place for escaped slaves. Really, it's an effort to undermine the British, right? The British are trying to make efforts to use slave labor to profit, growing tobacco in Virginia, whatever, so on and so forth. And the Spanish are like, hey, we'll give the slaves a safe place to come, and then the British will have to lose some of their slaves, etc., and make it harder for them. And again, that's in 1689. 4 years after that policy begins, you have King Charles II issue a decree that any escaped slaves from any British colonies will be granted their freedoms in Spanish Florida as long as they convert to Catholicism and they serve 4 years in the Spanish colonial military. And again, not really out of like goodness of their own heart, right? Again, to undermine the efforts of the British. In 1738, you have Fort Mose, that's built just north of the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine. Fort Mose is where all freed, baptized, former enslaved people from the British colonies are sent. The fort is really the first line of defense against any military offensive from the British to the north. It is the first free black settlement in what is now the United States. So not only was Spain able to entice the slaves to run away from their British enemies in the north, they're also able to enlist those escaped slaves to defend Florida against British invasions. Now, later in 1739, Fort Mose will become a destination for slaves that are trying to leave South Carolina during the Stono Rebellion, slave revolt that we will talk about in 4.6. So keep this in mind when we get there. But many of the slaves that take part in that revolt are from the Kingdom of the Congo. So they were already Catholic. They have an ability to speak Portuguese, which proves really helpful as they take up residence in Spanish Florida. But again, we will talk more about that when we get into 4.6. So we've already covered Portugal's trading post empire in India, but other European states also want to expand their influence into Indian Ocean trade networks. Now, after a Portuguese carack named the Madre de Dios, carrying precious metals, spices, and books, and containing information on Asian trade routes, was captured by the English in 1592, it really brought around a great interest in the East Indies by English merchants. Now, again, here to give you a little bit of context, we have the East Indies and now the West Indies. The East Indies are these islands off of the coast of India in Southeast Asia. The West Indies are in the Caribbean in the New World. Okay, so just keep that in mind if we use these terms. But the British form what's called the East India Company in 1600, and the primary goal of the East India Company is to establish a trading post in India, not unlike Portugal's trading posts that are already there. This is a company that is royally chartered, so chartered by the king. It is a joint stock company. It is given permission to use military force against the Portuguese, but it is a company, right, that is kind of given this authority, right, by the king. And it began setting up small trading posts in India. Now, the East India Company not only has to deal with Portugal, right, while it's establishing itself in the Indian Ocean, But it also struggled against the Dutch East India Company as well, which was established in 1602, just 2 years later. And the Dutch East India Company controls the spice trade in Java. The Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, they frequently engage in battles in the Indian Ocean over trade routes, trade territories, etc. We will talk more about what a joint stock company is, although I'm pretty sure once you realize what the definition of a joint stock company is, you are very familiar with the idea. But we will talk about joint stock companies in a little bit more detail when we get to 4.5. Lastly, for this section, we get into Africa, right? The competition among these European powers to dominate trade leads to growth and expansion of some states that we've already talked about. Now, the Asante Empire here in West Africa, in what is now Ghana, is an example of an African state that really prospered during this time period. Right? They're later kind of dragged into conflict and war with the British, but it really prospered in this time period because of European influence in trade. The Asante Empire primarily trades in gold and slaves. And in return, the Europeans bring weapons and gunpowder to the empire, which help it expand its borders. So, this period of trade is characterized um, by competition between the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch merchants, and led to, again, a time of great prosperity to the Asante Empire. So, as a result, a lot of the artwork that's produced by the Asante Empire um, in this period in the 17th and 18th century. So pictured on the slide, you have some pieces of artwork from this period. But again, just this is not something that probably would have happened unless this empire was doing pretty well. They would not have focused in any sense on artwork. So keep in mind that there are benefits, that some people do benefit from this European rivalry. There are a lot of drawbacks and a lot of negatives for a lot of regions, but there is some positives. There is sort of a silver lining, if you will, for some people. All right, so now for the back half of this lecture, the focus of this section is economics. So here we will talk about the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor systems from 1450 to 1750. So we'll talk about disruption, restructuring due to the arrival of the Portuguese and the Spanish, but we'll talk about the existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean. And then we'll talk about developments of colonial economies in the Americas that depended on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems, including the Mita system, etc., and then including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, the encomienda system, and the hacienda systems. Those are all things we will touch on in this section. And as we start this section, this is a really good point to reiterate and understand exactly what we are talking about when we say Indian Ocean trade, right? This is where some students kind of find themselves getting lost and thinking that when we talk about the Indian Ocean trade, we're really just talking about like India, for example, or coastal India. And it's really not. It's this entire region between Africa, India, Asia, the Middle East, etc., right? Everything that you see in this circle here. So when we start talking about economic systems in the Indian Ocean, we're referring to Eastern Africa, we're talking about India, the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean is used to refer to this larger region, anything that really borders around the Indian Ocean. The arrival of the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch to this region is what brings about not only changes, but remember, we also want to take a look at continuity and the things that stayed the same in these existing trade systems. Now, one of the things that we want to recall from this earlier portion of the lecture is the Swahili city states that Vasco da Gama not only encounters but later invades on his first voyage to India. The Swahili coast is the area that's marked in light blue on the map. The Arabs, the Swahili Arabs that are there, have a long and rich history of trade. And we touched on that in 1.5, for example, both inland trade, maritime trade within the Indian Ocean, etc. Right, and we also talked about the Swahili city-state of Kilwa, which had one of the largest ports in East Africa, is a major trading center that connected places as far away as Great Zimbabwe and China. right? Now, the Omanis, which are highlighted in red on the map, are a crucial part of facilitating trade for centuries before the Europeans arrive in the Indian Ocean. They are in a strategic location that makes them a hub for trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and they are excellent shipbuilders. The Gujaratis, which are highlighted here in yellow on the western coast of India, kind of in the northwestern corner of the Indian Peninsula, they produce fabrics and textiles that are, very high in demand. They grow to really rival the Omanis as kind of the great seafarers in the Indian Ocean. And then lastly, you have the Javanese in Southeast Asia, which we touched on this region in 1.3, right? This is a very active region in the Indian Ocean prior to the arrival of the Europeans. The Javanese really control this infamous Strait of Malacca and control the spice trade that originates there. So, again, this map really just to orient you as to who exists where in this region that we're talking about. So, the answer to the question, how does the arrival of Europeans to the Indian Ocean change existing trade systems? The very short answer to that is, despite some like structural changes, some restructuring, trade in the Indian Ocean really continues to flourish and thrive after the arrival of the Europeans. The slide here gives some brief examples on how some changes are brought about to some of the original, like regional merchants of the Indian Ocean upon arrival. But what's important for you to note here is that the Europeans are often very heavy handed, very forceful in their dealings with existing merchants and trading ports. But ultimately, the goal was not to destroy the trade network, but rather control it and capitalize on it. So, for example, um, the Omani and the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese wanted to control the Omani port city of Muscat in 1507. And they gained control, in 1507. And they remain in control until 1650. The Omanis are engaged in a rivalry over control of trade, and they would attack the Portuguese held Fort Jesus, in Mombasa on the Swahili coast in 1696. They gained control over the port and over the fort, and the Portuguese no longer controlled that important trading city of Mombasa. So again, so the Swahili Arab merchants continued to trade, but experienced some restrictions from the Portuguese. The Omanis, have this back and forth to maintain control. The Gujaratis engage with the East India Company from England that's given rights to set up a factory there, but the Gujaratis remain very important trading partners in this region despite the presence of the EIC. And then the Javanese, the Dutch East India Company, really controls Java and the spice trade, but some areas of Java remain independent and really continue engaging in their own trade. So there is a lot of change. There's a lot of change to the structure of trade in this region, but it's adapted, right? There's still, it's almost like there's room for everybody in this region, if you will, because trade still flourishes for a lot of these people and a lot of this region as a whole. Now, in this next portion of the lecture, we're really going to look at the second historical development or the second key concept here. Newly developed colonial economies in the Americas largely depend on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems, including the Incan Mita system, and introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and encomienda and hacienda systems. So here we're going to get into all of those different labor systems and how they worked in the Americas. So just switching gears here just a little bit to economic systems in the Americas. And Spanish Cuba is a good example of what is called the plantation economy that developed in the Americas that required a huge amount of labor. When the Spanish begin using Cuba for the production of sugarcane, they initially enslaved the native population known as the Tainos. By the mid 1500s, most of the native Taino population of Cuba had been completely wiped out. So there's this need for a new source of labor to replace the Tainos. and keep up with this growing sugar production. So, this is when African slaves are imported into Cuba as chattel slaves. So, the Portuguese colony of Brazil is also a huge importer of African slaves because of its sugar plantation economy. And Brazil dominates sugar production in the 1500s, and that production begins to shift to the Caribbean and places like Cuba in the mid 1600s. The British economy and the British colonies in North America also relied on chattel slavery for their agricultural based economies. From 1672 to 1713, you have an estimated 125,000 African slaves that are brought to the British colonies via the Middle Passage. So, here we really want to have an understanding of what chattel slavery is. It is one of the most common forms of slavery in the Americas, where an enslaved person is treated as property. And that property, just like if you were to think of it as a house, a car, a horse, whatever it might be, right? That property could then be bought, can be sold, could be inherited, could be passed down to a family member, so on and so forth, right? That is what chattel slavery is. Okay. And it's also important to know that under chattel slavery, if your property, in this case, the enslaved person, had a child, that child is then born into slavery, right? That child then becomes part of that chattel, of that property. So, while that's very different than we saw in other examples where the children of slaves would not be born into slavery, that's different than those examples that we've seen previously. Here, under chattel slavery, particularly in these plantation economies, that is the case. We also see examples of indentured servants. And again, an indentured servant is a person that is contracted to work without salary for a number of years. Maybe they want to come to the Americas, but they don't have the money to pay for it. So they would be granted this contract that says, we will take you to America and you will not have to pay for your trip, etc., as long as you work for us for, say, 5 years, right? So these indentured servants come to the British colonies in North America first through the Virginia Company, right? So there is a huge demand for labor in the colonies, but a lot of Europeans cannot afford the trip to fill those jobs. So the Virginia Company solves this problem by allowing laborers to borrow against whatever money they would earn in the colonies to pay for the trip. So they would sign a contract agreeing to work maybe like a year, 2 years, whatever, in exchange for the voyage to the colonies. So here on the right, you have a contract from the 1800s, right? It's estimated that probably more than half of all Europeans that come to the British colonies from around 1600 up until right around the Revolutionary War are indentured servants, right? And then here on the left, you have a notice on newly arrived indentured servants to the colonies. Indentured servitude labor later surpasses is later surpassed by slavery in the British colonies. So it's not huge. It's big at the beginning, but then slavery, chattel slavery, really catches up and passes over. And then you have the meta system, which is something that we have talked about before, particularly in 1.4 when we talked about the Inca, for example. So prior to the arrival of the Spanish, this meta system is a form of public service in the Incan Empire. All men aged 15 to 50 gave a certain amount of time every year as a form of payment or tax or tribute, working on public works projects for the empire, whether that was like building roads, building walls, what have you, right? So it was important that those people who work in the Mita system have enough time to still kind of take care of things at home, their own personal family lives. So labor in the Mita system is regulated so that it offered a balanced life for those who had to participate. Now, after the Spanish colonized and overthrew the Incan Empire, the existing Mita system was adapted for the benefit of the Spanish. Now, the Spanish were interested in mining silver and silver had been discovered in a city called Potosi in what is now Bolivia. So it is Francisco de Toledo who was sent to Peru in 1569, and he used the Mita system as a way to send native laborers into the silver mines in Potosi. So this result of this change to the Mita system is a breakdown of native communities. People would flee this new Mita system, would flee public works projects such as roads, and those things that they had built before degraded and broke down. So the traditional Mita system had been transformed into a new form of coerced labor, right? It was no longer this balanced program that was like to provide for the empire. It was really only really to benefit the Spanish. It was an exploitation of labor. So pictured on the slide here, you have an illustration of Potosi in 1553. The mountain that's shown here is home to the silver mine, and it was referred to as the mountain that eats men, right? So the Spanish no longer are using workers to maintain roads and things like that, right? That's why those public works things break down. They are putting people to work in very dangerous position, right? Mining silver, right? And so that's why people start to flee. They're no longer working on roads and things like that. So that's where this change happens. The Mita system still continues, but differently, right? And not to the benefit of the Inca. Now, the Spanish also developed a system called encomienda, right? And this concept of encomienda originates in Spain after the conquest of the Moors during the Reconquista in 1492. The people who conquered and took over more territory, the Muslim territory in Spain, were given the right to use the people that they conquered, the conquered non Christians, as labor, right? And in exchange, uh, those laborers were supposed to receive certain benefits, particularly protection. Now, that system is then taken and expanded into the Spanish colonies, not only in the Americas, but also in the Philippines. But it took a much more inhumane form in the Spanish colonies. In Hispaniola, for example, which is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the natives there were in a revolt against the Spanish governor, Francisco de Bobadilla, who the Spanish crown had replaced with Nicholas de Ovando in 1502. De Ovando is credited with really implementing the first encomienda system in the Americas in an effort to kind of put down the revolt from the Taino people. And it is his implementation of the encomienda system that becomes a new labor system that is much more brutal than the original encomienda system from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. In this system, the natives were forced to do hard labor. They suffered harsh punishments. They suffered death in the event of any resistance. And the encomienda system in the Americas really more closely resembled slavery, while the original system in Spain really resembled like feudalism, right? So in Europe, it was, you've taken over this territory, you are responsible for these people, so you will give them protection, and in exchange, they will give you work. Here in the Americas, it's you Spanish have claimed this territory. These are the people that live here. You will exploit their labor and make them work, right? Are you offering them protection? No, because if they fight back, you will punish them and even kill them. So the encomienda systems in the Americas are the subject of a lot of controversy because um, of their corrupt nature, right? There's lots of corruption. People are exploited. There's harsh conditions. The Spanish crown considered these natives in America to be subjects of the crown, right? And so therefore they were given some protection. But most systems really only lasted a few decades in most regions, but they do last a lot longer in Mexico, in New Spain, and in Peru. But all encomienda systems are banned and abolished by the Spanish in 1791. Which leads us to the hacienda system. The hacienda system is one in where the Spanish conquerors are given land to be used for agricultural purposes. The labor, the coerced labor, the forced labor, was used within the hacienda system. This system is really similar to the manorial system in Europe that we talked about, the manor house, the serfs, etc., that we talked about in 1.6 when we did this developments in Europe. So if you want to kind of refresh yourself, I would flip back to 1.6 in your notes. But there's usually a large estate house, the hacienda, and then the fields are either crops or livestock to be tended to. So what you see on the slide is from a dispute over land that is adjacent to a large hacienda in New Spain. The livestock was to remain inside the red lines because they had been kind of encroaching on native farm sites outside of the hacienda. So again, you kind of see what that map would have looked like. And again, I would encourage you to try and flip back a little bit to 1.6 in your notes and refresh yourselves on the manorial system because they're very similar systems. Uh, but historians have really had a very difficult time understanding the relationship and the difference between these two systems in Spanish colonial America. There are some arguments that have been made that the encomienda system really gave rise to the hacienda system, or that these two systems were pretty much intermingled. They existed together, much like the kind of feudal system and the manorial system do. And again, I would encourage you to flip back to 1.6. These two labor systems that were used in the Spanish colonies are different. They are distinct systems, but there is a lot of overlap. So, again, the biggest distinction that we can make between the two systems lies in the kind of legal definition by the Spanish crown, by the Spanish king. Encomiendas were the direct result of a law passed by the crown that granted the right to collect tribute from non Christians in conquered lands in the form of labor. So it was sort of like a tax on people who are not Christian in land that has been taken over. The haciendas are lands that have been given to someone by the Spanish crown, right? So it's a land grant, right? So say the Spanish king likes, I was about to say John Smith, but Juan Pablo, if you will, and says, you know what, I'm going to give you some land in the Americas, use the labor there that exists. So it's sort of a land grant that's given to a particular person. But the encomiendas and the haciendas really operate in pretty much the same ways, but it's the kind of underlying aspects of how that land is given, how those rights are given, how the access to the labor is given, etc. Right? That really differentiates the two. Now, for part 3 of this lecture, and I told you 4.4 was huge. There are 3 parts to this lecture. The focus here is social interactions and organization. If we were going back to our SPICE T chart, this would be S for social aspects. So that's what we'll be focusing on here. We'll be talking about the changes in continuity in terms of slavery in the period of 1450 to 1750. So we'll talk about enslavement in Africa continuing in its traditional form, including incorporating enslaved persons into households, etc. And then we'll also talk about the growth of the plantation economy, increasing the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas. So, as we've talked about, forms of slavery exist in Africa and in most other parts of the world prior to the transatlantic slave trade. And we can go back all the way to topic 1.5 when we talked about the states in Africa. Right, slaves from West and Central Africa are traded along the Trans-Saharan trade route. They're traded along the Indian Ocean trade routes. Many West and Central African societies are slaveholding societies, and those slaves are generally people who are captured from outside groups that are at war with one another, right? So Group A is at war with Group B. Group A wins. They capture some people from Group B, and those people are held as slaves. And remember, one of the distinctions that I tried to point out to you about slavery in Africa is that it is not based on race, right? It is really based on either indentured servitude, owing a debt of some sort, or being a prisoner of war, right? So those prisoners are usually put to work in some fashion. This is a really common extension of things, very common form of slavery in Africa. Elites or royalty from various African states considered their slaves to really be an extension of their kin group. The slaves themselves are not considered property, which is another difference comparing it to slavery in the Americas. But whatever those slaves, those enslaved people produced was the property of the slaveholder. So, like if the owner, or I wouldn't say owner, slaveholder is really the distinction because owner kind of elicits property. But if the slaveholder had a farm and the enslaved person worked on crops or produced crops, those crops belonged to the slave owner, the slaveholder, excuse me. So this is again a very different type of slavery from chattel slavery in the Americas. Again, in chattel slavery, the slave itself, himself, herself, themselves, is considered to be property, right? The enslaved person is the property, not what they make, the person themselves. And that person can be bought, sold, or inherited. And the children of slaves are also considered an extension of that property, sort of in the same way that if you own a dog, well, their puppy, if they have a puppy, is yours, right? That is your property. Um, so this is not really the case in the traditional forms of slavery in Africa, like I've mentioned. Non-chattel slavery in Africa continues after the Europeans begin trading in slaves in the 1500s. So again, this represents the continuity in African slavery, but it does not mean that the new slave trade between Africans and the Europeans does not bring about changes. So we want to recall, for example, one example of slaves that we've talked about: the large procession, the large Hajj of Mansa Musa from the Mali Empire on his pilgrimage to Mecca that included over 10,000 slaves. That happened in 1324, so like 200 years before the Europeans begin really engaging in the slave trade in Africa. So slavery existed previous to Europeans, it existed after, it continued in a very similar fashion, but let's talk about it from there. So, if we look back to topic 4.2, the example of the colony of Brazil within the triangular trade, the labor demands of sugar production are so high in the late 1500s to the 1700s that Brazil receives about half of all enslaved people that are brought to the Americas via the Middle Passage. And we want to remember that the Middle Passage is the transportation of slaves from Africa, or enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. That is the Middle Passage. The Caribbean region is also a huge destination for enslaved Africans, again, because of sugar plantations there as well. This is a very dangerous and demanding place for these enslaved Africans to work. These colonies are the destination for about 90% of the enslaved people that are taken to the Americas. The other 10% go to the North American colonies, the British colonies, for example, with tobacco plantations in places like Virginia and South Carolina and such, taking on the majority of those imported slaves. And this slave trade, this transatlantic slave trade, lasts from 1526 to 1867, right after the Civil War. But the key point in discussing these changes to slavery through the transatlantic slave trade is the development of chattel slavery itself. Chattel slavery is much more brutal than any of the forms of slavery that we find and that we have discussed up until this point. We've talked about slavery in almost every society that we have talked about, from European to African to Asian to Middle Eastern, etc. some form of slavery has existed in all of these regions. It is not until this period, the 1500s, the 1700s, even into the 1800s, that we see this transition from people being put to slavery because of their owing some form of debt, indentured servitude, or prisoner of war status to now being sold and bought and traded as a commodity, as as property. That is the change that we are discussing here. So again, the traditional system of African slavery continues in Africa even after we see the transatlantic slave trade begin, which brings about that chattel slavery. So it's important to recognize that chattel slavery does not replace traditional slavery, but rather it is a new form of slavery that affected enslaved people that left the African continent specifically for the Americas. The word chattel, for example, literally refers to a piece of property. And this gives us some insight into how chattel slavery really differed from traditional African slavery. Slaves in the Americas are part of the chattel slavery system, and they are stripped of all elements of personhood, right? They become property. And one effect of this notion that slaves are not considered people is that they become disposable. They are worked quite literally to death on these sugar plantations in places like Brazil and the Caribbean. And when they die, they're just replaced, right? It's very tragic because it's almost as if no one really cares about them. Are there people who do? Sure. But for the vast majority, that is not the case, right? And this is part of the reason why there is such a huge majority of slaves that are taken to the Americas go to Brazil and to the Caribbean, right? And so this slide here highlights some of those differences that we've talked about between chattel slavery and the traditional forms of slavery. And a major point in the development of chattel slavery in the Americas is that it is based upon race. And that is something I've been trying to drive home for you anytime we've talked about slavery, especially when we've talked about African slavery and slavery that existed in Africa prior to the Europeans engaging in the slave trade. Slave trade before then is not based on race. It is based on a variety of other factors, but not race. It is not until the Europeans begin taking slaves as property, begin taking people as slaves and consider them property, that we see that become race based. So anyone eventually that is of any form of African descent in the Americas is given slave status. It doesn't matter if they somehow made it to the Americas for any other reason, but anyone of African status or African descent is given slave status in the Americas. So slavery becomes associated with race and skin color. So, what are the effects? What are the changes because of slavery? In the Americas, the slave trade causes a huge demographic shift simply just because of the sheer number of people that arrive from Africa. In both the Caribbean and South American colonies that use slave labor, there's a lot of racial mixing that occurs because Europeans in those colonies typically don't have their families with them, right? The men there don't have their families with them. So we will call that racial mixing, if you will. In North America, right, you have many entire families from Europe coming to the colonies, which reduces the number of racial mixes that happen compared to the Caribbean and Brazil. So, additionally, you also see laws that are introduced to segregate people in North America based on race, which also preventing some of that demographic shift that occurs in other colonies, for example. So, it's really important. Brazil, Haiti, and North America, they're all very different, right? But again, we still see shifts in some form or fashion in the demographics of the Americas. Now, over the course of the Atlantic slave trade, Africa loses about 12 million people. This is a systematic extraction of people that produce, long-term negative effects within the African continent and particularly in West Africa. Of the 12 million enslaved Africans that are sent to the Americas, about 10 million come from areas along the western coast of Africa. Now, because younger, stronger men are typically the targets of these slave raids, a lot of societies really begin to weaken, and they are then conquered by neighboring warlords, right? And then you also see the population loss that's experienced in those areas are most often targeted by slave raiders, which causes severe poverty. You see a halt to social and economic development. So a lot of the problems that we still see today in Africa with regards to social and economic development get their start for in some aspects to the slave trade here in the 1500s. So for African societies that are directly engaging in the slave trade with the Europeans, the effects are obviously a little bit different. During those active years of the slave trade, those states grow incredibly wealthy. But as the slave trade slows because of new laws banning the trade and because of new technology that requires, less manual labor, those once very successful, prominent states and kingdoms really decline very quickly, which leads then to the Europeans taking over a lot of those kingdoms later on. So overall, the slave trade sends much of Western and Central Africa into a massive social and economic decline. So, again, thinking forward, a lot of the issues and problems we see in Africa currently in present day trace it all the way back to this massive extraction of population in the 1500s to like the 1700s and 1800s.